This video is sponsored by Premium Sound, one of the UK's premier dealers located in Kensington, London, with an online store carrying a comprehensive inventory to cater for a variety of needs. For more details, click the link in the description. I was curious about the Mofi Sourcepoint 8s when they first came out. They're part of the first range of speakers from highly acclaimed designer Andrew Jones since he departed from ELAC and landed at Mofi Electronics. But truth be told, I hesitated before deciding to review them. There were a couple of reasons. I reviewed the ELAC Unify reference speakers last year, and whilst they offered decent performance for the money, their boosted bass and rolled off treble wasn't quite my thing. It's crazy how quickly and unwittingly prejudices creep up on you. I must have dismissed the Mofi Sourcepoint 8s at the time of their launch and assumed they'd be in a similar vein. The other reason I hesitated is that this is a very competitive market segment, especially in the UK. There are so many great sounding stand mount speakers for under £3 grand. I always want to get things in for review that stand a fair chance of doing well. So what changed? Well, a couple of people whose opinion I respect seem to really like them, so I decided to give the Mofi Sourcepoint 8s a chance, and I'm really glad I did. The Mofi Sourcepoint 8s retail for £2,999 in the UK, and they're a similar figure in dollars in the USA, although I have seen them on sale for less. There are 3 satin finishes: white ash, walnut and black ash. Despite the Sourcepoint 8s only being half the cabinet volume of the 10s, they are still substantial stand mount speakers, measuring 456 by 290 by 335mm, that's 11.4 by 18 by 12.6 inches, and weighing 12.7 kilograms or 27.9 pounds. The most striking feature is the sculptured front baffle that distinguishes it from ubiquitous MDF boxes. I wasn't convinced about the styling until I saw the speakers in the flesh. Now I consider it a welcome departure from the norm. Magnetic grills are provided for those who prefer not to have the drivers on display. Removing them reveals a 200mm 8-inch dual concentric driver. The midwoofer cone is made from a paper pulp with a 32mm 1.25-inch soft fabric dome tweeter mounted centrally. On the rear are one set of good quality speaker binding posts and 2 bass ports. This allows greater flexibility to tune the bass than a single larger port. According to Andrew Jones, blocking one port will extend the bass by half an octave and drop bass sensitivity by about 3 to 4 decibels, useful for close to wall placement. The UK distributor also supplied the optional stands. They seem good value at £360, a robust 3-pillar all-metal affair with an appropriately sized top plate and sufficiently large bottom plate to keep the speakers stable. But I stuck with my Target R4 stands for the purposes of continuity and performance. They have thicker gauge platework, are lead filled and fitted with Stack Audio over isolation feet. I want to discuss some of the design choices that Andrew Jones has made with the Sourcepoint range. Unsurprisingly, he went for dual concentric drivers, but they are a little different to what he's done previously at ELAC. A significant difference is the size of the cabinets and drivers. They're much bigger, 250mm or a 10-inch driver in the Sourcepoint 10s, and 200mm or 8 inches with the Sourcepoint 8s, which is what I have here. This gave Andrew the opportunity to get more sensitivity out of the speakers than he'd get from a 5-inch or 6.5-inch driver in a smaller cabinet, whilst maintaining similar levels of bass extension. There's a balancing act that has to be achieved between sensitivity and bass extension. For any given size cabinet, a designer has to trade one parameter for the other. The Mofi Sourcepoint 10s have a sensitivity of 91 decibels and bass extension down to 42 Hz, whilst the Sourcepoint 8s have a sensitivity of 87 dB and a bass extension of 47 Hz. Both speakers are rated as an 8-ohm load in accordance with IEC standards. Those bass extension figures aren't going to make any headlines, but Andrew Jones doesn't play the game of inflating specs like many other manufacturers do. He could have gone for more bass extension by designing drivers that had greater excursion, but there are benefits to using large paper cone drivers and keeping the woofer cone movement to a minimum. Tannoy have famously used large paper cone drivers, including dual concentric variants that have been around since 1947. Some vintage Tannoy drivers have risen to folklore status, changing hands in the used market for thousands of pounds. Tannoy use compression horn tweeters, which allows the crossover point to be lower. This is important if you're using large drivers for the mid-range, because the point at which the large driver starts to narrow its dispersion and start beaming is going to be lower. So if you want a seamless crossover between the two drivers, you need the tweeter to play lower. But Andrew hasn't used a compression horn tweeter. He's stuck to what he knows best, but using a larger than normal size 32mm 1.25 inch fabric dome tweeter, and by placing it in the middle of the midwoofer so it acts like an acoustic amplifier, lets the tweeter play down to 1600 Hz. That resolves issues with the crossover in the mid-range, but there's still challenges to overcome at the frequency extremes. The larger tweeter is also going to start beaming at a lower frequency than smaller tweeters, so I'd expect the Sourcepoint speakers to be a little bit more sensitive to the toe-in angle that you set them up at than many competitors. Paper cones are great for mid-range duties because they have softer breakup modes than many other materials, ideal as the midwoofer is probably playing up as high as the designer can get away with. But paper isn't great at handling bass. The lack of stiffness at low frequencies can cause distortion. That's the benefit of large drivers with minimal excursion. You're not flexing the paper cone enough for it to be a problem. The trade-off is reduced amounts of bass extension, but there's another benefit to keeping the woofer cone movement to a minimum in a dual concentric design, and that's reduced amounts of intermodulation distortion. That's caused primarily by the tweeter signal being altered by an oscillating woofer. Do you remember your high school physics when you were taught about the Doppler effect? Quickly going over other aspects of the design, the deployment of extensive internal bracing will unquestionably stiffen the cabinet. The sculptured front baffle will aid with edge diffraction effects, but the sharp lip along the edges is likely to do the opposite. If designed correctly, one of the benefits of dual concentric drivers are that they approximate a point source, and that translates into excellent off-axis performance, generally means easier room placement and a wider listening sweet spot. They have their drawbacks as well, but I'll leave that discussion for another time. Finally, let's take a look at the architecture of the driver itself. The use of a neodymium rather than ferrite magnet system is interesting, but I'm not going to get into that. The twin magnet system has been designed to improve flux symmetry across the operating range of the voice coil. The copper ring between the two magnets helps to reduce flux modulation caused by the voice coil moving and minimize inductance variations in the voice coil itself. All these are attempts to reduce distortion in the driver, so let's see how it sounds. The Sourcepoint 8s are all about their mid-range performance, but I'm going to start with the bass. For the size of speakers, these are not bass monsters. There's good bass extension, satisfying bass weight and reasonable bass definition, but it's the kind of bass that's a little plump and cozy, like good vintage speakers. The SP8s won't give you the percussive thump of something like the Buchart S400s, especially the Mark I variant. Even though the Danish speakers are smaller, they'll dig down lower and hit harder. Even the much smaller Amphion Argon 1s with their 130mm 5¼ inch midwoofer aren't far behind the Sourcepoint 8s for bass extension or weight and offer better note-to-note bass definition. The mid-range is what makes the Mofi speaker special though, with a wonderfully open and natural presentation. That large paper cone woofer renders vocals and lead instruments with realistic acoustic mass, nice separation, all wrapped up in a fluid delivery. The soundstage has excellent depth, although these speakers won't disappear like the best stand mounts I've heard in their class. The soundstage does extend nicely beyond the speakers left and right, but there is a touch of vagary about the location of performers. The excellent quad Revela ones are a bargain at £1,800 and will pull more detail from your recordings across the frequency range, tighter bass, crisper and cleaner mid-range, and with ultra-revealing highs. But if you're cross-shopping the Revelas for the Sourcepoints, you need to sit down and work out exactly what you want from your speakers. The quads will tell you precisely what you're getting out of your recordings and what you partner with them. The Sourcepoint 8s are uber forgiving of poor recordings and place only reasonable demands on partner equipment while still offering very good levels of detail. The high frequencies follow in a similar vein to the mids in the sense that there's nothing obviously lacking. There's good presence in the upper mid-range, Not bright or rolled off, just nicely judged, but the treble isn't as revealing as the class leaders. I know someone's bound to ask me about my Proact Response 1SEs, even though I'm trying to retire them from review. Like the quads, the 1SEs will delve deeper into recordings. The 1SEs will tease out more textures, nuances and subtle inflections in tone. That's helped by an area top end and more mid-range resolution. But even though my old Proacts will extract more information from recordings, the information unearthed by the Mofi speakers is presented more effortlessly, and that's the key strength of these Sourcepoint 8s. It's a characteristic they share with the Castle Windsor Earls, similar sized speakers that retail for £3,849. When I reviewed them back in September 2023, I found the Castles to have a warmer tone, but I wouldn't describe the Mofis as neutral either. Now for the controversial bit. I'm aware that these speakers have been measured and shown to be reasonably flat, and that those measurements have been done in accordance with industry standards, whether they be from the CEA, AES or IEC. Normally what you're talking about is a measurement that's done on axes with the tweeter at a distance of 1 meter and a gated response to take care of any reflections in the room. Those measurements only give you a rough indication of the tonality of a speaker. Besides, you are unlikely to be listening to these speakers at a distance of 1 meter on axes, so the off-axis performance and various psychoacoustic effects also need to be taken into account. John Atkinson of Stereophile has been measuring speakers for as long as I've been an audiophile. His measurement is a better indication of how you're likely to perceive the sound. Ignore the blue and red plots for the woofer and the port responses in the near field. It's the black curve that we're looking at. The measurement is averaged over a 30-degree horizontal window and taken at 1.27 meters or 50 inches from the speaker. It's been corrected for an anechoic response, but still shows a distinct rise of up to 5 decibels between 50 and 200 hertz. There's certainly a lot more to it than one measurement, but it's the 100 to 300 hertz region of the frequency range that's most associated with a warm sound, and that's exactly how I think the SP8s will play out in most people's rooms. A little bit on the warm side. The Mofi Sourcepoint 8s play well at low volumes. I'm talking about average listening levels at around 60 decibels. They'll also play loud as I dare have them anyway. For short periods I had them at average listening levels of around 90 decibels, and the sound hardened up a little bit, but no more than other speakers that I've experienced of this size. And if you look behind me, you'll notice that they're a little wider apart than I usually have my speakers, with a bit more toe in. I had them pointing directly at my shoulders. You don't want them pointing directly at your ears. That upper mid-range, the presence region it's known as, starts to bite a little bit. You also don't want to listen too far off axis, certainly not with the speakers firing straight down the room. They're not wide dispersion speakers, and you lose some treble energy and detail unless they're towed in. Give them a little bit of space to breathe if you want to retain reasonable levels of bass definition. If you have to shove them up against walls, it's quite handy that you can put a sock in one of the 2 ports. Just realise that that does come at the expense of sound staging and imaging ability. Sourcepoint 8s are quite forgiving of the partner equipment that you place with them, but due to their openness in the mid-range, they are quite revealing of the nature of the amplifier. In fact, I once heard Nelson Pass comment in an interview that he still uses custom vintage tannoy speakers when developing his amplifiers, not because they're the most detailed speakers, but because they're very telling of the differences between amplifiers. The Sourcepoint 8s seem to share this characteristic. It's not entirely surprising given there are similarities between large paper cone tannoy drivers and the ones found in these Mofi speakers, but the SP8s will also impose a little bit of their sonic character on your system. The only amplifier that I felt was too compromised was the Willsenton R300 Plus. With its 8 watts per channel, the mid-range sounded fabulous, but there just wasn't enough watts to keep the bass lines under control. What worked great was the Willsenton R8 with stock tubes. I haven't got round to switching back to the upgraded tubes after doing my comparisons with the R300 Plus that I just reviewed. Without the fancier tubes, the stock R8 has a few rough edges in the mid-range and treble. These were smoothed out perfectly by the Sourcepoint 8s, while still delivering the scale, energy and good levels of detail that the R8 is capable of. Too many rules can rob a child of an easygoing and happy-go-lucky nature. That's exactly what the Hagel H190 sounded like with the SP8s. Competent, but too much control stripped the life out of the low frequencies. My Exposure 2510 was an excellent playmate for the Mofi speakers. These speakers deserve amplifiers that have a natural and expressive mid-range with enough power to keep the bass lines in check. That's precisely what the 2510 delivered. Despite the Mofi Sourcepoint 8s having a front baffle that looks like it's been lifted from a stealth bomber, these speakers have a hint of a vintage vibe about them. Maybe it's the stocky proportions, sturdy build, but I think it's more down to how they sound. The 8-inch dual concentric driver delivers a mid-range that is natural and effortlessly open. It reminds me of much more expensive vintage tannoy speakers from a bygone era. There's a little bit of softness in the bass and some veiling of high frequencies, which means the most analytical type of listeners will probably look for other options, even though there's still very good detail here. But it's their forgiving nature with partnering equipment and recordings of questionable quality that win them many fans. The Mofi Sourcepoint 8s get highly recommended from this channel. These speakers definitely had me reminiscing about experiences of the past, and that got me thinking. My question for today is, what do you think about vintage speakers, or the whole variety of retro speakers that are out there these days for that matter? Please let me know in the comment section. I think that'll be an interesting discussion to have. All that remains for me to say is, if you like what I'm doing with this channel, you want to see it grow, and assuming you haven't done so already, please like, share, subscribe, hit the bell notification. Check me out on Patreon. There's a couple of consultancy tiers you can access there if you think I can help you on your audiophile journey. Also check out the ABA Club on Patreon for some great ways to interact with me and fellow Patreons. But for today, for now, British Audiophile, signing off.